They pulled up like they owned the place. Designer coats, hard plans rolled under an arm, smiles that were too bright for a January morning. The car door slammed, and the cold wind pushed at my scarf. They stepped out and unrolled those blueprints right there on my mailbox, as if the mailbox belonged to them. For a moment I thought I was watching a play I hadn't been told I was in. "I'm Helen," I said, because politeness is a hard habit to break. They didn't look surprised. They looked as if they'd been waiting for me to introduce myself. They stood in my driveway with the architect's plans rolled under their arms. They looked at me like I was already a ghost. If you're watching, drop your city and state in the comments. I like to know who's listening. My name is Helen Parker. I'm 68, and I've lived on this land in a small town in Ohio for more than 4 decades. That land is everything I had with Frank. It was a map of our life together, where we'd planted an apple tree when our boys were small, the slope where we watched storms roll in, the little stream the deer liked to cross. Frank and I bought those acres 43 years ago, with the kind of stubbornness only 2 people who had nothing but each other could muster. We paid for it in muscle and lunches on the tailgate, in winters that made our teeth ache, and summers that made the garden sing. Frank died suddenly 2 years ago. The shock is a particular kind of cold that lives in your chest. You learn how to move around a house that's colder in places where a person used to stand. You learn that grief makes you less certain about everything. Your memory, your balance, what a knock on the door will mean. People were kind at first. Then the kindness changed shape. David, my older son, married Brittany when they were young. She was bright, ambitious, always quick with ideas. Thomas, my younger son, moved to Seattle years ago, quieter, more careful about other people's boundaries. After Frank died, David and Brittany began to visit more. At first it was dinner and flowers. Then they brought plans. The plans were the kind of plans you see in magazines. Clean lines, a 3-car garage, a deck that would look over the valley. They called it a family place. They said it would be where the grandchildren could run and where we could all gather. They were always so careful to say we and family. At the kitchen table, with the kettle hissing and the smell of frying onions filling the old house, Brittany unfolded a different kind of kindness. "Why don't we just make this easy?" she said. "Give us the back 5 acres. We'll put the house back there. We'll leave you your home. We'll take care of the upkeep. Nobody will have to worry." They had already seen the map in my handwriting, the parcel lines we'd scrawled in the night after a bottle of cheap wine, dreaming. 5 acres sounded small, spoken aloud, smaller than the whole. When somebody describes a loss in pieces, it is easier to swallow. They called it a gift. They called it love. They arranged for a local real estate attorney to draft a deed. The paper arrived tidy, crisp, the language so smooth it soothed you into complacency. It said, "Transfer for the sum of $1. A $1 promise for 5 acres that had been watered by my hands, plowed by our backs, anchored in our bones." They said it was just paperwork to avoid future trouble, to make sure nobody could challenge the plans. They told me it was normal and quick and, most persuasive of all, that it was what the family wanted. I signed it. It was an act of grief and faith, and of not wanting to make a fight where a fight felt like more pain than I could bear. I remember thinking of grandchildren running on new grass, of David and Brittany sitting on a deck in a sunset we had watched together before. I remember the draft catching at the kitchen window, and the way the paper bent in my hands like a leaf. For a little while after that they were attentive in a way that made me dizzy. They fixed a gutter leak, brought casseroles, reminded me of appointments. They were everywhere I wanted them to be. But kindness has a shelf life when it is tied to a plan. They built quickly. Where there had been the sweep of grass and the old maple, there was soon the thump of machines. The smell of fresh-cut wood filled the air. Lights burned into the night over the frame of a house that had my name in the deeds, but not in the way they treated me. The first time I walked the perimeter to see how the foundation looked, one of their contractors blocked my path with a stack of lumber and told me the area was a construction zone. "Private site," he said. The phrase felt like a chilly draft across my shoulders. The house took shape, and with it a new way of being in my own place. Invitations dwindled. Phone calls became about favors and logistics. Could I leave a gate unlocked so materials could be delivered? Could I move a mailbox so trucks could turn? Small requests that always had their edge. Comment after comment about the old house being hard to maintain. A suggestion that maybe I should think about getting something smaller if I wanted the family to use the land safely. A look, sometimes from David, quick and careful, that pushed me into complying because he wasn't daring to voice it aloud. The first time I found my driveway blocked, I was on my way to a follow-up at the clinic. A flatbed truck sat where I needed to go. I knocked on the contractor's trailer door, and a man waved me off. They said they would be done in an hour. The hour stretched into 2, then 3. My phone rang with a text from Brittany. "Sorry, Mom. It's so hectic today. Can you maybe just wait until tomorrow?" There was a brusqueness I had not earned. It wasn't only the physical barriers. Nuisance calls began at the township office complaining about a noise someone alleged came from my property. An odd thing given that I was inside, knitting, and the only music I played was the radio soft. The garden hose that had always watered the flower bed seemed to lose pressure. Once I found the well cover moved and muddy footprints heading toward the stream. Little things they said in passing, about how it would be easier if the property was consolidated, were not little to me. The turning point wasn't one day. It was the drip of many small betrayals. The housewarming came without me. I watched from my porch as a line of children, my grandchildren, ran out to their new lawn and then were pulled away by adults who didn't look back. I received a short note. "We are sorry you couldn't come. We thought it might be awkward." Awkward. They had invited friends, neighbors, and even other developers I had never met. They had made a party of a place I had lived in silence for years. They'd made a life there and left me as a spectator. Once, during a thunderstorm, a trench had been dug without my consent near the old access lane where I drove my pickup. My tires sank in wet gravel one morning, and I had to call a neighbor to help pull me free. Later, the neighbor told me that the trench redirected water runoff toward the lowest part of my yard. "They did it to change the slope," he said. "I don't think they considered your foundation." The words hit me like a fist. They began to complain to neighbors about the way my property looked, as if long-time upkeep were a failing rather than a history. They called code officers claiming there were hazards, an old shed that had always stood unremarked, a septic pipe that allegedly needed inspection. When the township inspector came, he found nothing dangerous. Still, the visits in the middle of the day carried a message. "We can make things difficult." Then the offers began. "Why not let us buy the rest?" David asked one afternoon, folding his hands over the kitchen table, as if asking for a modest favor. "Nobody else would care for it the way we would. We could give you $300,000 and you could move someplace cozier." 300,000 sounded like a number from another life. I had never imagined selling the rest, not at a fire sale price. When I asked what the land was worth, the tone changed. "Well, you know how appraisals go," Brittany said smoothly. "Things are worth what people will pay." They spoke as if they were doing me the favor of offering money at all. The truth was, I felt cornered. Grief had made my judgment soft, but something in me tightened at the notion of being pushed out by my own family. I could have said no. My hands trembled with the paper when I had signed for those 5 acres. I had reasons, fear, tenderness for the idea of grandchildren, that made me give pieces of myself away. When the offers escalated to pressure, I found the dividing line between being helpful and being used had been crossed. One morning, after weeks of subtle exclusions, I found a note tucked under my door. Please consider. We can make this easy for you. Think of the kids. No amount of considering made the notches stop. They began to place calls to local contractors asking about removing an old stone wall at the edge of my garden, as if the wall did not mark a boundary, but a suggestion. Once, a man they hired parked a backhoe with treads on the edge of my yard and began to level the land. I stood at the window and watched the sculpture of my memories get grinded into flat earth. Neighbors watched, some with sympathy, some with silence. You learn quickly how many people prefer their calm to your fight. I became a rumor in the town square. Did you hear they're changing Helen's place? Folks whispered about family disagreements, the way people whisper about storms. They talk as if it happens to someone else. It would be easy to make David and Brittany into monsters and breathe life into that caricature. They were not that simple. I remember David as a boy with skinned knees who broke his arm climbing a maple and cried in my lap. I remember Brittany as the woman who baked a pie once when Frank's back was bad and brought it over like an offering of warmth. Yet behavior reveals character faster than memories do. I watched as a small, persistent entitlement grew in their faces like ivy, slowly covering the kindness underneath. They wanted land, room, and the freedom to build a life that did not include the inconvenience of another generation living next door. I began to lock my door in the afternoon when visitors left. I learned to check my mailbox for notes, to not assume a knock would be friendly. Once, David stood on my porch and asked me to sign another paper, this one a temporary access easement so trucks could use the back way, in and out. He said it would be only while they built. He said it would help keep heavy traffic off the public road. I looked toward the little lane that used to be my shortcut, and suddenly it felt public only in the sense that anyone could take it. I asked him to leave the document with me. He sighed and told me it was fine. We could handle it later. But it was not fine. That little request turned into a key, and they began to test doors. It was after a month of this that a man from the township knocked on my door with a complaint form. "We've had a call about a blocked access lane off of County Road 7, he said. He squinted at his notepad. "They identified your property as part of the approach." I told him nothing had changed on my side. He nodded, politely puzzled, and left. But I had the strangest feeling. They were remapping my life without telling me. The nights became harder. Lights from the new house glowed into my kitchen window when I woke to use the bathroom. I was awake more than I slept. Sometimes the radio in the bedroom was the only voice I let in. Friends suggested I should be thankful they'd built nearby. That family close by was a blessing. I nodded and smiled at the right moment, but there was a small, cold laugh at the back of my ribs that kept me awake. Then there was the day the children's bikes were moved from beneath my maple and placed on the manicured lawn with a pink ribbon around the handlebars, the way one rows up flowers for a memorial. They invited the grandchildren, they courted the grandchildren, and they left me on the periphery. The hurt you feel when your family decides to recalibrate affection around geography is a particular sour thing. I tried to be practical. I had always prided myself on being sensible with money and property. I began documenting the things that happened. Times when a truck blocked my driveway, when construction lights shone into my bedroom window, when the hose wouldn't carry water. I wrote it in a notebook, neat handwriting like someone who still believed paper could hold truth. But truth in a notebook does not stop a backhoe. When I finally told Thomas on the phone what was happening, he decided to come home. He booked a flight. I can still remember the relief like a soft, warm hand across a wintered cheek. Thomas was the one who had always sent postcards from the West Coast. the one who would send pictures of rain on a rooftop he loved but never boasted. He called and listened without shifting blame. He said he'd be there in a week. The week felt like a lifetime. I watched the house grow as if it were a living thing. My conversations with David and Brittany turned terse. I caught the look on David's face sometimes when he thought I wasn't watching. Something like guilt mirrored with resolve. There were nights I sat in the kitchen with Frank's old cup and tried to imagine what he would say. Frank had been a man of few words, but he loved that land the way the ocean loves the shore. He'd have hated what they'd done. The morning Thomas arrived, the air was thin with the smell of diesel and damp earth. He stepped out of the car with Marcus. Marcus, Thomas's husband, who had a practical, watchful way about him that made me feel steadier. They stood on my porch, looked out toward the new house, cupped their hands against their eyes like they were reading a long, bad sentence. Thomas hugged me long and hard, like a child and a parent melded into one. Marcus put down his bag and immediately started to look around, like a man cataloging what needed repair in a house he had just discovered. I saw a kind of anger in Thomas that had the clean edges of someone who knew how to focus a wrong into action. "Show us everything," Thomas said simply. He sat with me at the table while I told them the list. The deed, the blueprints, the paper with the $1, the notes tucked under my door. Marcus listened without interrupting. When I produced the deed, Marcus read it twice like someone checking the seams on a coat. "What do you want to do?" Thomas asked. There wasn't a hint of hurry in his voice, but there was a strictness I had longed to hear. For the first time since Frank's funeral, the future felt like it might be something I could shape, rather than something that had been shaped for me. I could feel the weight of what had been done. 5 acres exchanged for $1. Invitations that turned into exclusions. A driveway that one day might be declared someone else's. Each detail was small, standing alone. Together they had a shape. Someone had been preparing to take the house of my life and make it into the stage for a different story. When Thomas and Marcus looked toward the new house from my porch, they did not see only timber and siding. They saw the pattern of construction that spoke of decisions made without regard to me. Marcus knelt and ran his hand through the gravel where the trench had been dug. He found something there, a small, flattened piece of paper with tire marks across it. He didn't say much. He folded it and put it in his pocket. I watched them with a mixture of relief and a fresh kind of fear. Hope came with its own cost. To hope is to invite the possibility of disappointment. But let me tell you, it was a true thing to feel less alone, to have someone say plainly that what had been done to me wasn't right. When Marcus stood up, his jaw was set, and Thomas's fingers tapped a rhythm on the table that meant thinking. I felt like the land itself had exhaled a little. They wanted to talk to neighbors. They wanted to take photos to map out where trucks had been, where fence lines lay. They wanted to talk to the attorney who signed the deed, the man who had put $1 at the bottom of a document that had cost us decades. They didn't say aloud all the possibilities. They were practical. They were careful. That night I slept differently. I woke early and walked down to the old stream. The sky was pale blue, and the air smelled of thaw. For the first time in a long while, I felt that a different sort of work had begun. Not the slow, quiet inventory of what had been lost, but the deliberate arrangement of what might yet be saved. I made tea, and sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread around me like small maps of a war. There is a particular kind of violence in a family that turns private love into leverage. It is quieter than shouting, but no less fierce. The way words become ways to move you, the way offers become pressure, the way smiles can close around your throat. Thomas and Marcus left the next morning to speak to a neighbor who said she had seen surveyors near the ridge. They came back with names and a faint line on her face that told me she had been on the phone a lot. They started to make lists of things that needed to be photographed. They measured the width of the old access lane with a tape measure I hadn't used since Frank was alive and building things. "You don't have to decide anything tonight, Mom," Thomas said quietly, folding a photo of the new foundation into his wallet. He had that way of speaking that made the world feel smaller and manageable, as if a thing's size could be reduced by training attention on it. I nodded because I wanted to believe him, but the anger under my ribs had warmed into something else. Resolution. I could not bring back the years Frank and I had spent building a place, but I could keep tending what remained. There were choices to be made, and perhaps with careful hands, I could shape them so that my home remained mine in more than name. They left to find a local attorney who might look over the papers. I stayed at the table and turned the deed over and over, the $1 printed in small characters that carried a great bitter weight. Outside, a loader hummed in the distance. The new house's frame cast a long shadow across the field where the apple tree had stood. I pressed my hand to the kitchen window and could still fiercely imagine Frank's voice saying, "Stand your ground, Helen. You earned that land." I had, for years, believed that family would be a kind of protection. That belief had been unmade, but standing at the threshold of what might be a fight, I felt for the first time in months a certain clarity. Grief hadn't made me weak, it had made me human, and that was worth some apology to myself. I was not the same woman who had signed away a piece of her life on a cold day. The papers lay there like a challenge. When they returned that afternoon, Thomas and Marcus were carrying more than the usual travel bag. They had a camera, a notebook, and a quiet steadiness. Marcus put down a thermos of coffee and looked at me as if measuring the weather in my expression. "Let them come," he said, in a way that was not a shout, but a promise. "If they're going to make decisions about this land, they can answer to someone else first." That promise felt like a shield. It didn't resolve anything. It only created a space in which something could happen other than the slow erosion of my life. We sat listening to the distant sounds of saws and the occasional radiating thump of a hammer. The house on the 5 acres was raising itself up precisely where we had once watched the sunset and said goodnight to the world. I thought of the afternoons Frank and I had spent at that window. The smell of his jacket mingled with the earth after a rain. Somewhere inside me a memory stirred. He had once said that land remembers who's tended it. I placed my palm flat on the table so that the papers didn't tremble. I didn't yet know how deep the law would cut in our favor, or how cruelly it might fail. I only knew that my life had been rerouted, and for the first time since the funeral, I wasn't willing to be rerouted without a word. When the 3 of us stepped out toward the lane, the new house loomed like a guest who refused to leave. A man on the porch waved at us as if to show hospitality. David and Brittany stood talking with a couple of men in hard hats, and when they saw us, they paused. The way Brittany's smile changed when she saw Thomas said everything. Calculation rearranged into surprise. "Mom," David said, one of those words that can be both a pleading and a demand. He held out a hand, but his eyes looked elsewhere, like he was searching for a rope to pull back on what had been unleashed. Thomas folded his arms and spoke slowly. "We need to talk," he said. It wasn't a polite invitation. It was a firm request that meant boundaries were being set. In that moment, I felt the air change. A house can be built in timber and steel, but home is a thing of agreements and care. That morning we began to redraw those lines. The fight wasn't yet in the courthouse, and nothing had been declared void or valid. But a different sort of reckoning had begun. One that started with noticing, naming, and refusing to be dismissed. I looked at David, at Brittany, at the men with their plans. I saw in their faces the possibility of regret, of apology, of explanation, maybe even of a different choice. I also saw the stubbornness that had led them to this point. I thought of Frank, and the way he would have walked down the hill and looked at what was being done without approval. The first part of the story ends here, at a threshold. The machines continued their work in the field, and across the kitchen table the deed lay quiet, a small square of paper that had been given more meaning than ink could hold. Outside, my sons argued quietly. Inside, I began collecting the threads of proof of what had been taken, not to prove my own worth, but to protect what remained of our life together. The next steps would be quiet as well as loud, conversations with neighbors, a careful compiling of documents, the slow and steady work of refusing to be erased. We started to gather what we could: photos, notes, neighbor statements, a string of little things that, when tied together, looked less like accidents and more like a plan. Thomas and Marcus kept working methodically, like people who had practiced steadying a ship. They took pictures of tire marks, of the trench, of where the trucks had parked. Marcus walked every fence line with a tape measure. Thomas wrote down dates and names. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to keep my hands steady while the proof came together, the way a seamstress takes a messy tangle and straightens it into a line. We needed professional eyes. Marcus knew a woman, Rebecca Chen, who lived a few towns over and had handled property matters for a few people they knew. Rebecca answered the phone in a voice that felt brisk and careful, the kind of voice that made you feel someone's mind was working in the room with you. She came out 2 days later, followed by a stack of legal pads and a soft look that said she had seen hard things before and didn't flinch. Rebecca read the deed like someone tracing the path of a river, start to finish, then back, and then again with a pencil. "At first glance," she said, "this looks like a fairly routine transfer, but there are oddities." She marked a line and leaned in. "This attorney who prepared it, do you remember him? Who was he?" "I'd met him once, the man who had come to our kitchen and waved a pen and a smile. He was local. He'd been polite. I remembered him saying it would be simpler this way. That detail, simple, quick, a $1 token, had been soothing when grief made my decisions feel slippery." Rebecca paused and tapped higher on the page. "This language here on the access, it's vague. It talks about reasonable access but doesn't describe where. And this clause, this one, suggests the attorney had some involvement on the other side. We need to see his file." When she spoke of conflicts of interest, she didn't say it like a punch. She said it like a fact to be turned over and examined. That phrasing, conflict of interest, made me feel both betrayed and oddly vindicated. It made the paper speak louder than the friendly hands that had presented it to me. She took the deed to her office and called the firm where the man had once worked. Days later, she sent a short email that made my stomach hollow. The attorney who had prepared my deed had been suspended from practice around the time he drew the document. There were notes, disciplinary records, a companion file that showed he had been representing both parties in similar matters and had not fully disclosed those ties. Rebecca said the word void slowly, as if tasting it. If he was not licensed at the time, the transfer can be challenged. A deed needs proper legal signings and proper authority. If those were lacking, the deed may have no legal force. I had to let the meaning land. A deed is a piece of paper that says someone owns something. Void meant that little slip might not actually have changed ownership. It doesn't mean outcomes are guaranteed. It meant there was an argument to make. It meant I had a path I hadn't thought I would have when I signed in a fog of grief. Rebecca didn't promise miracles. She gave me a plan. First, preserve evidence. Second, start a formal challenge to the deed, and ask the court to stop anyone from using my land in ways they had no right to. Third, examine easements and access claims. She explained things plainly. An easement is basically a legal permission for someone to use a strip of land for a specific purpose, like a driveway. If the easement is not properly described, it's not as useful as it sounds. If a driveway everyone liked to use actually sits on my property and wasn't granted by a lawful document, that changes the map of what people can and can't do. We filed papers. I signed more forms than I had in years, my name over and over, each time with a steadier hand. Rebecca arranged a preliminary hearing to pause the construction of anything that directly invaded where I lived. David and Brittany fired off their own counsel. Predictable. A racket of paper and motions asserting emergency rights to access and to complete their build. They said urgency. They said grandchildren and community. I breathed in the language of my sons and felt it trying to wrap me again. The first time I stood in court, my knees shook. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and dust, a place heavy with other people's griefs and fights. Judge Margaret Thornton sat with a neat stack of files and a look that made you speak honestly. Her voice was not dramatic. It was an unadorned thing that cut through pretense. When Rebecca spoke, she did it without theatrics. She laid out dates, hands, signatures, the timeline of the attorney's suspension. Judge Thornton listened. Then she asked the straightforward question only a real judge asks. What is the likelihood that the plaintiff, Mrs. Parker, will be harmed if the court does not temporarily restrain changes? It sounds dry to say it now, but when she asked, I felt the weight of my life hinge on an answer given in a room where words make worlds. Rebecca talked about the trench, the blocking of the lane, the attempts to reroute water. She showed the judge pictures of trucks where my truck should have been parked, a photo of the children's bikes with the ribbon. She did it with the careful, plain language of someone who has seen things like this before and refuses to be sentimental about them. Judge Thornton denied the emergency demand to let the builders use an improvised access that cut through my property. She said the balance of harms favored preserving the status quo until the issues were better documented. That was not a win. It was relief. It meant the trench was not going to be widened that afternoon, and my driveway would not be turned into a pile of gravel. The court hearings multiplied. Discovery meant that papers came out that neither side could keep hidden. We learned that the attorney who had drafted my deed had been under scrutiny at the time he touched that paper. The other side had been represented by someone who later had his own ethics questions flagged. It was a muddle of poor conduct and sloppiness. But in that muddle, Rebecca found the sharp edges we needed. At a deposition, when a courier brought in a missing file, Rebecca found a line in the attorney's notes that spoke of representing both land interests without a disclosure to one client, me. She also found a memo suggesting the access described was not a permanent legal right, but a convenience used while the land was raw and uncleared. Those memos may have been dry in a stack of paper, but they looked very different when combined with photos of the trench and the notes I'd been tucking under my door. There were moments of human collapse in the courtroom, simple and terrible. David sat with his head in his hands once and looked 20 years younger. Brittany's face had become a practiced neutrality. She smiled like a woman who'd been trained to keep an expression for public appearances. When Rebecca put the evidence on the table, David's lawyer took a breath, like someone who had known this part of the script might come. When the critical hearing came, Judge Thornton did something that felt, for reasons I couldn't name at the time, like opening a window. She ordered that the deed be examined by an independent reviewer and allowed depositions that revealed the attorney's license had lapsed around the time he prepared the documents. That information, an attorney not licensed at the moment they prepared a deed for a major transfer, tilted the scale. It did not instantly return the acres to me with a flourish. It did, however, strip some of the legal armor that the $1 deed had been wearing. Rebecca explained to me afterward what seemed important to remember. A voided deed doesn't automatically undo every action taken since. There were third-party rights to consider, improvements on the land, and very human people living in a nearly finished house. She said, "In your case, these findings strengthen the position that the transfer was not legally effective. It opens the door to asking that either the deed be declared void or that fair compensation be paid if a court determines the reality on the ground has created new equities." She did not say which route was better for me. She said what the papers state allowed us to ask for. Sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom, I watched David pass by. Our eyes met, and something like grief reopened. He didn't say much. He had always been a man who spoke less when ashamed. There was a little of that in him, a pause in breath, a recognition perhaps that we had strayed into a place where love had been taxed for money. Negotiations followed like a tide going in and out. The other side pressed urgency, a need to finish the house. We pressed for acknowledgement of wrongdoing and for an outcome that wouldn't leave me in a worse practical position, even if, on paper, the deed had been faulty. The appraiser Rebecca asked came back with a figure for fair market value that startled even her. Roughly $1.2 million for the 5 acres in the condition the land would be after all improvements were considered. I remember the room going quiet when that number landed on the table. It changed the geometry of the argument. If the court said the deed should be void, the reality of a house already built complicated matters. If the court said David and Brittany could keep the house, they should pay for it at fair value. I did not want spectacle. I wanted to be safe. I wanted the security to stay here and to ensure Frank's years of work didn't dissolve into a cautionary tale about grief. We moved toward mediation rather than a prolonged trial for one reason. An ugly public battle might rent us more than loss of land. It might carve a hole in the children none of us could repair. Yet mediation didn't mean leniency. It meant bargaining with a clear aim. David and Brittany's financial picture was not as robust as the plans had suggested. They had borrowed, as many people do for big projects, and their lender's willingness to advance final funds depended on a clean title and a settled access route. When the appraiser's $1.2 million figure met their balance sheet, the math didn't sit right. They proposed to purchase at $800,000, an amount that Rebecca described to me plainly as a compromise figure that recognized the house's presence, but also the risk of a legal fight that could, in the end, leave them with nothing. They argued through their counsel that they had invested in the development already, and that a figure somewhere between 0 and fair market value would be equitable. We sat in a mediation room that smelled faintly of coffee and legal pads, and agreed to terms that were more than I expected, and less than the appraiser had suggested. They would buy the 5 acres for $800,000. The offer included firm deadlines for financing and a clause that cut direct contact with me off. They could not come to my home except through formal arrangement with our lawyers. There was to be a condition that if they failed to close by a certain date, they would either remove their house or accept erasure of their title. It was a hard bone to swallow, to sell the land I loved to the people who had tried to edge me out. But Rebecca explained the practical reality. If the court might take years and the risk of losing outright remained, a settlement that secured my independence and compensation was a more certain protection. Signing the final papers felt like a strange sort of funeral. The numbers were written in ink that would, from then on, live in bank ledgers and tax forms. David and Brittany sat opposite me with faces that had lost their practiced impatience for a moment. We did not hug. We did not share a meal after. The room felt like a place where choices arrive, not as dramatic sentences, but as small, inexorable facts. When the check cleared and the deed was recorded again, this time in very clear terms, with counsel and oversight, the house on the 5 acres belonged to David. The conditions we had negotiated held. Finance deadlines came and went with the nervousness of people who had to prove to lenders that their dream had a legal root. When the payments began to strain them, I learned that dreams built on shaky ground don't hold long. What did I do with the money? I did what Frank and I would have done. Thought about legacy and steadiness. I hired a contractor to build a proper, separate access road to my home that did not depend on anyone else's convenience. It was a road small and practical, paved enough to keep my truck out of the mud and to keep the water from pooling near our foundation. I subdivided a parcel, doing so only after careful talks and after making sure that new boundaries would protect the homestead, and placed one small parcel in a trust for Thomas. I sold a neighboring parcel to a couple who had lived nearby for years, and who wanted it simply as a garden and a place for their visiting grandchildren. That sale quietly undercut the idea that developers could come in and remake the ridge as they'd planned. Thomas and Marcus became the kind of daily anchors I had missed. Thomas's visits became more frequent. He and Marcus planted new hedges along the lane and helped me hire someone to prune the apple tree so it would live another winter. The money meant I didn't have to worry about someone trying to force a sale on me again. It meant I could walk away from doorstop negotiations and rest in a legal certainty that had taken months to build. David and Brittany's life after the settlement was not easy. The payments were heavy. The house they'd built came with debts that didn't match the initial dream. They argued about money in tones that made my stomach ache. In small-town ways, people noticed. There were rumors, always the safe currency in a place where people prefer gossip to confrontation. I heard that Brittany's mother, Sandra, avoided the grocery store for weeks. The family tables that once bent under casseroles went quiet. Calls home became less frequent not for holidays, but for simple reasons of avoidance. We did not reconcile in any neat, cinematic way. Reconciliation is a long, patient thing, and sometimes a bridge that will not be built. David visited once after the settlement, leaving a thin envelope on my porch with a note that said, "I'm sorry." The note was all that was honest in him that day. I left the porch light on for a week and then turned it off. Thomas and I agreed that safety and dignity sometimes require distance. In the years since, I have learned that justice often looks different than you imagine. It is not always a shout or a headline. Sometimes it's a quiet reordering of life that makes room for peace. Sitting on my porch now, I see the house on the 5 acres across the ridge, a 3-car garage, a deck that catches the sunset, and I feel no triumph. I feel a relief so bitter and so clean it could be medicine. My mornings are quieter. The sound of the road is different. The apple tree is smaller, but it is still ours. I think about the line between help and taking. Grief makes you soft in places where people can tuck a hand and move pieces of you without noticing. I don't say this to heap blame into old wounds. I speak it because I want the story of how I decided to stand up to be heard. It took me time to find that muscle again. It took the arrival of people who would see the facts with clear eyes and the patience to fight paperwork and small-town inertia. It took Rebecca's steadiness and Thomas's return and Marcus's practical mind. It took the court's willingness to examine a piece of paper and ask whether the ink had been given by someone who had the moral right to hand it out. Are there regrets? Yes. There is a sorrow that some things could not be returned. Time with grandchildren who now grew up with new rhythms, Sunday dinners that shifted to new addresses. There is a cost to boundaries. Saying no to family changes the map of who gets in and who stays out. But boundaries also protected me from being hollowed out. In the quiet that followed, I planted a small bed of lavender where the old stone wall had once stood. It smells of summers, and neighbors now cut sprigs to take home. When people ask what I would tell someone in a similar place, I say 2 things, and only 2. Be careful with gifts, and keep records. But I try not to sound like I'm offering law talk. I say those things like a woman who has learned by being burned. The law was a tool that helped me in my case. It was not a talisman. Courts don't fix everything, and not every situation resolves as mine did. I tell the truth of what happened to me, because truth can arm someone with the courage to look up from grief and notice when help is becoming pressure. My relationship with David is where it is. Strained, sometimes cordial at a distance, rarely intimate. With Brittany, contact is minimal. With Thomas, there is a new, easy rhythm. Laughter sometimes at breakfast, quiet evenings in the kitchen, the sort of small mercies two people discover when they make room for one another. Marcus, who arrived as a practical companion, is now a friend who mows my lawn when the snow threatens the walk. Rebecca still calls on my birthday. She joked once that she'd prefer cake to legal invoices. There is grace in small acts like that. Sitting now in my kitchen window, the afternoon stretching into a sun that softens the red of the barn across the valley, I sometimes wonder how the story would have been different if grief hadn't been so heavy those first weeks after Frank died. But grief is a human thing. It cannot be wished away. It is part of the story of how we become both vulnerable and capable of brave acts. If someone watching this is feeling the slow pressure of family asking them to sign, or to hand over pieces of home under the glossy name of help, listen to that small voice in your chest that says, hold on. Protect what you can. Ask questions and surround yourself with people who see what you see. I say that not as legal counsel, but as a woman who learned the hard way that dignity is something you cultivate like a garden. The work feeds you back. My house is still the house Frank and I built. It creaks in January like it always did, and the kettle still sings on the stove at 5 in the morning. I have neighbors who stop by with pies and news and an occasional handshake. Some family ties remain, some do not. There is a room in my life now that is devoted to the memory of what was, and another room filled with plans for what is to come. I am older, yes, but I am also steadier. My hands know how to protect what matters. If you're watching, and this landed with you, know that you are not alone. If you want to hear more true stories like this, subscribe or follow. There are lives that teach us how to stand.